It's time to bring you yet another amazing episode. And now, welcome your host.
Good to have you on the podcast. This is Omobola Stephen, the host of the Backstory with Omobola Stephen. On the Backstory, we like to shed more light on what has not worked and what we make it work. We focus on government and politics and other subtopics like society and culture, the environment, science and technology, and the economy. We know there have been a lot of issues that are besetting the global world today. There have been a lot of debates and counter debates, yet there's no respite or solutions to all these troublesome situations that beset the global scene today. Which way to go? What are we doing right or what are we doing wrong? And how can we get it right? Now, this is the mission and the focus of the Backstory with Omobola Stephen. We share disruptive yet constructive mindship conversation on insights that is going to pivot the positive changes the world needs in general. Today, I have Jeff Wennigner, who is a nationally recognized expert in law enforcement, as a retired lieutenant with over 33 years of experience, primarily with the LAPD. Thank you once again for joining me on the show, Jeff.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. We'll be talking about the law enforcement in the US. What has changed and in what ways can it be improved upon? So I'm looking forward to a great time as we explore this important topic. Now, looking at the police use of force in terms of protecting themselves or others, making arrests or regain control of a situation. But really, when do we say that force is justified?
Well, really, this is in my wheelhouse. I spent 33 years with the Los Angeles Police Department, and the last portion of my career I spent as a lieutenant writing the adjudication for the chief of police for the Los Angeles Police Department on all lethal force and officer-involved shooting cases. And then I transferred over to the officer in charge of the detective entity who investigated all of those types of cases. So I look at this through a different paradigm than the vastly most people that work in law enforcement, because I've had my hands in over 700 cases, lethal force cases. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. So over time, what has occurred is that there has to be an evolution of law enforcement that's consistent with the evolution in the expectations of society. And due to what I consider somewhat of an insular culture in law enforcement, there tends to be a lag with the law enforcement keeping up with the expectations of the society in which they provide service to. And oftentimes the force incidents, which are never easy to watch, are the things that cause society to have negative impressions of law enforcement, and sometimes justifiably so, if we're honest about that. So it's really incumbent upon law enforcement to evolve over time to look at the best practices, not only in the training of their personnel, but in their handling in the investigation of these cases, their transparency in regards to handling these cases post-incident, and their adjudication and holding people accountable. And one of the largest voids that I've seen over time has been what I call it's the policy practice void. It's the policy and procedure and the training shares the values and the expectations of the organization, but there's a cultural void where they're not aligned. And culture always trumps training and policy. And that's where we oftentimes see these discrepancies in what the expectations of the organization and the society members are of the law enforcement professional serving their communities and what the ultimate outcomes are.
Now, really, the national use of force data collections, they offer a big picture insight rather than information on specific incidents. The collection does not assess or report whether officers followed their department's policy or acted lawfully. Now, the question on the minds of the audience is, do you think this is a case for concern, or what are potential solutions if there is?
Well, the United States Supreme Court had a ruling, it's Graham versus Connor, which states what the standard for adjudicating officers' actions in the application of force is to be, and that is objective reasonableness. Would an officer who's similarly trained and with similar amount of experience in that same type of situation acted in a similar manner? That is, in essence, the standard that is to be applied when you're determining whether the actions of an officer are appropriate or not. Now, herein lies the real problem, is that it's the training. Is the training that this officer had, is it consistent with the actions that we saw, or did they substantially deviate to the point where they may have had some officer created jeopardy? Where oftentimes where we see this, I'll give you a perfect example, is where an officer will purposely place themselves in front of a vehicle and then fire at the vehicle as it's fleeing. They've actually placed themselves in harm's way, creating the circumstance where they're at risk of serious bodily injury or death because of the movement of the vehicle. Where by and large, the best practice in most law enforcement agencies policies require officers, if at all possible, to not step in front of the vehicle and to get out of the way, because shooting at a moving vehicle, can create bigger problems than actually it will resolve.
All right, so I'd like us to move to law enforcement and school campus safety, because this is also rife. Now, what do you think is an effective campus security reform that the government thinks should consist of? Do you like to share your insight, especially on your expertise with your 33 years of experience?
Well, listen, during my career when Columbine, the high school shooting in Colorado occurred, I was working Metropolitan Division with the Los Angeles Police Department, which in essence is the special forces of the department. That's where the SWAT and K-9 are all housed. And they sent a contingency of SWAT officers to Columbine to study that incident, to better identify a law enforcement response that would be more effective than what occurred there. And what they came up with, which is currently used today, is called immediate action rapid deployment tactics. And I taught those tactics to LAPD officers. And then about 4 months after the Columbine shooting, we had a shooting at a Jewish elementary school up in the San Fernando Valley that I was an initial responder to. So, and I've entered that chaotic scene. And then we had an LAX shooting where you had a TSA officer that was shot and killed, and there was an active shooter in Terminal 2 at LAX. And I just happened to be the officer in charge of the detective entity that had to investigate that. So I have seen all of these types of highly critical incidents that oftentimes involve schools or universities. And I see it through those three different lenses. And so ultimately, where we oftentimes miss the boat is, say, in schools, people think that that placing a school resource officer in the schools is the answer. And I'm more inclined to suggest we need to follow what the empirical evidence and research demonstrates. Oddly enough, when an officer is present in a school at the time of a school shooting, there's 3 times as many people that are injured or killed than when there isn't one. It's kind of counterintuitive to what we would think, but that's not really a preventative measure, because you're counting on circumstances where you're hoping the officer will be in the right place at the right time. The amount of rounds that can be fired in just a matter of seconds and the amount of people that can be injured and killed in that short period of time is catastrophic when you have no assurance that that officer is going to be somewhere close by. So really what we need to focus on are the things that are more preventative. In these shootings, whether it's a school shooting, K through 12, or it's at a university level, 4 out of 5 times, there is a minimum of one person other than the shooter that is aware of the intentions of the shooter. So what is key there? What's key there is that we have to make sure that we are creating an environment where we're developing strong relationships, adult and student relationships, where they feel comfortable disclosing information that they may have or hear about, so preventative measures can be had. So parents can't just send their kids off to school and expect the school to take care of everything. It takes an entire village to raise a child, and parents need to actively be involved in their students' activities. I'm retired from the LAPD after 33 years, and I'm now a volunteer crossing guard in my village where I live. It's a population of 4,100 people. And every afternoon I cross the students that are in the intermediate school. And it's amazing what I can learn by just interacting and engaging with those children. Is that we need to make sure that we're putting into place practices that are going to enhance the relationships where students feel comfortable coming to adults who then can take preventative measures. And that's important. And it's important to be able to identify what sort of things do you need to be looking for? Because bullying, isolation, increased access to social media and tablets and cell phones and things, all of those things are indicators of a potential problem. And here in Ohio, where I'm living now, it's the governor, DeWine, a year ago, he wanted to have a policy where it was forbidden to have cell phones in schools. And unfortunately, the legislators didn't go that far. They kind of, went with a lighter hand and just had a policy and made it required that each school district come up with a policy that encourages a minimal amount of the use, which is really contrary to what the evidence in the research shows. And that having those phones in schools is going to create increased use of social media and increased isolationism. And these are the types of things that you need to be preventing, because those are the precursors to violent acts in the future.
All right. So going ahead, how can security be beefed up? Because I tell you, this is really worrisome. Do you have some strategies that the government can begin to work on, or are there new policies that the government need to start instituting in order for this change to happen?
Well, security, you have law enforcement, and there's, Sir Robert Peel, he was, he's the father of law enforcement. It's the people are the police and the police are the people. And that's very important to understand that. And we have to understand that law enforcement isn't the answer to everything. And in the past, historically, they've tried to take on things that they're just not equipped or have the expertise or training to actually maximize their response to. And the perfect example will give you is that like 36%, upwards of 36% of officer-involved shootings are of those of people that are suffering a mental health crisis. And we have over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. And anywhere between 15 to 18% of them actually have training on mental health or de-escalation. And unfortunately, then what ultimately occurs is officers aren't quite aware of how they're being perceived, just their presence and the brandishing of the various weapons and things that they're using with the intent of trying to de-escalate and peacefully resolve the incident. But actually, they're escalating the response that the person who's suffering a mental health crisis is actually having. I mean, think about it. If someone was pointing a handgun and a beanbag shotgun and a taser with the red dot on your chest and they're yelling at you, you and I are going to be extremely stressed. Imagine if you're suffering a mental health crisis. So what is law enforcement expecting is going to occur? It's pretty obvious what's going to happen. It's probably not going to end well. So there needs to be more partnering up with those who have the actual training to best address these circumstances and work with mental health practitioners and partner with them. And rather than having historically this idea that we can resolve all of these issues using the traditional type tactics that we've trained to use under normal circumstances. And that's really the crux of it. Law enforcement can't answer everything. And there's a lot of technology out there where people can use to provide officers that are off duty, but they can use them for security purposes, whether it's for their home when they're traveling, or you're a corporation and you're having an event, or you have to staff a large number of security personnel. There is that technology. There's a company now, it's called Illuno.com, ILLUNO.com. And anybody can go on that app on their phone and they can obtain a off-duty police officer for whatever type of security purpose they may have. And what's the advantage of that? You know you're getting somebody who's already vetted. You know you're getting somebody that's been trained, and they know how to communicate with the law enforcement agency in the event that something escalates and law enforcement on-duty personnel have to respond. It's a win-win across the board for everybody.
Right. Thank you, Jeff, for sharing that insight. But the root cause of all this worrisome situation is the abuse of the use of gun, which is gun violence, and so very rife in the United States. Now, in terms of the new administration of Donald Trump, what advice do you think, do you want to offer to him as regards gun violence?
Well, listen, when we talk about school violence, like we had just spoken about previously, the reality is that's a very unique circumstance to the United States. And I've traveled over to Europe. I've to do research for my forthcoming book on thin ice. And I met with the Metropolitan Police in London as well as the Paris police. And what's unique to London is, by and large, the general population, they do not have firearms. But they do oftentimes confront people that are armed with knives, hatchets, machetes, what have you. And there's going to be something learned from those law enforcement agencies in their handling of those types of incidents to de-escalate, because those officers aren't carrying guns either. So there's something that can be learned. But here in the United States, we have more guns in the United States than we have people in population. That's really actually quite shocking. But it is a reality, and it's a reality that law enforcement officers have to face every day when they go out there. There is the potential that anybody that they have interaction with could be armed with a firearm. And, I'm not one to debate the Second Amendment. It's a constitutional right to bear arms. But that being said, it just seems to me that it makes sense to ensure that we have some reasonable and logical firearms protections and controls to try to minimize these incidents of school shootings and the amount of violence that is actually going on in our schools and our streets and the cities in the United States.
Now let's talk of police management practices. What have you learned in the field, and what strategies do you think work best in policing in this worrisome time that we're in?
Well, people are people, and we, regardless of where you come from, what your background is, we're all very similar. And I have a unique background. I was born to a teenage mother, and she gave me up for adoption. I lived for a short period of time in a foster home before being adopted, and I was adopted, and then my parents then adopted my brother, who's Japanese, and then I had a foster sister who was Black, African American. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s in Kent, Ohio, in the Midwest. So I have a unique lens in which I looked at my law enforcement career through, and how I viewed race and society and the sociological issues that are associated or directly related to crime. And it's really about inclusion. People really, what people want to do is they want to feel safe, valued, and respected. And by and large, regardless of the crime rate in any particular community you may be policing, the vast majority of the people are wonderful people. And that's the reality. And it's important to reach out and include them in how best to police their communities. And that's where something is lost. It's law enforcement should not be putting themselves in a position where they're imposing their authority on communities. They need their authority is actually granted to them by the people that they serve. And it's important to be inclusive and ensure that you have programs where people are involved and have immediate knowledge of the things that are going on. And because law enforcement is an extension of society. It's not there to, as unfortunately historically, we have an embarrassing history in law enforcement where it started out with slave patrols. And law enforcement it was about control. It was about money. It was about protecting people's property and, their social status. And that's not where law enforcement needs to be now. But the history is embarrassing, and it's something we can't ignore.
Right. So let's talk about the court use of force and disparities. Now, in terms of people of color, people with mental illnesses, and the LGBTQ people. Now, the thing is, studies show that people in this category are more likely to experience force. So what is the role of the Supreme Court or law in this inequality issue, and what are the solutions if there are?
Well, when you look at, there's people that will argue these statistics across the board. You know, truth be told, they're proportionally speaking, yes, lethal force is used more often on minorities, the brown and black population of people in the United States than otherwise. But then you'll have people that argue, but the majority of lethal force incidents are not against minorities. I've looked at all the data. Part of my responsibility was comprising an annual report for the LAPD on all of these things. And reality is people can make that data say whatever they want it to say. That's a reality. That being said, it's about, in every interaction, treating people with dignity and respect. And you can't, we have to really ensure that in law enforcement, we're taking care of our officers and our officers' mental health. And what that includes is that we have to realize that no one calls the police when things are going well. They're called to come fix something. Something's going badly, and people's emotions are high. So unfortunately, what happens is law enforcement officers, if they're not taking care of their perspective on how they view things, they start painting groups of people with a broad brush. And you can't take your experience from a particular radio call and then project that onto other people within that community, because that's not going to be accurate, and it's going to be toxic in nature, because your attitudes and your beliefs are going to impact your actions and behaviors. And officers need to understand that. And it's really interesting. If you look at the research on force, across the board, the more highly educated a police officer is, the less amount of force they use. There was a study recently done with two mid-sized law enforcement agencies here in the United States. And they looked at the number of detentions that officers were making and the number of searches they were performing during those detentions, and then their use of force record, as well as their complaint record. And what they found is that people with a high school education had a much higher incidence of force and complaints than those who had a 4-year degree education or higher, although they had the same number of contacts with citizens and conducted just as many searches of people in the field. So law enforcement, that's a fact. I didn't make that up. It's just a fact. So law enforcement would be negligent if they didn't address that and encourage education in their organization, because it's demonstrated that we have better outcomes with people that are more highly educated. Now, why is that? I believe it creates, you have people that have, the ability to be better critical thinkers, and they may have more empathy and compassion and be problem solvers and be open to understanding themselves, because there's things about the way our minds work that we don't readily quite understand. We think that we're reactive. We're not. We're predictive. And Archer's like, well, I responded to that. I responded to that. You very much predicted it. So really, the hypervigilance in law enforcement of training that everybody's armed, everybody has a handgun, everybody's a threat, that hypervigilance can impact what you predict you're going to see on any given radio call, and then therefore influence the actions that you're going to have, which they may not be appropriate. But you have to be open to understanding these things. The science is there. And it's the neuroscience is really interesting. But law enforcement needs to partner up with academia and better understand these things so they can have policies and procedures that are more aligned with what the science is telling us we need to do to have a better officer and ultimately have better outcomes.
Right. Truth be told, police education and police training isn't enough, right? Changes is what makes the world go round. And, the thing is, if we don't embrace changes, we may never see the changes that we truly desire. So what other options or what advice we should you give the police department in regards to training the police force or the law enforcement force? Because really, it is important for them to have the right education in order for them to help the society improve.
Well, it really starts very early on, and the answers are there. It just may not be here in North America. If you look over at the Nordic countries, many of them require education to get on the job. Now, let's put this all in the context. Here in the United States, the average number of hours that you're trained in the academy before a police officer hits the streets is 860 hours. Now, let's compare that to somebody who applies for their cosmetology license. They have to have nearly twice that many hours of training. Shocking, isn't it? So then if we look at the Nordic countries, they oftentimes require officers to get and go through a 3-year program, which is equivalent to an undergraduate degree. And while they're going through that training, they are watching and assessing them and seeing how well do they respond to training. Because it's not always about what training you received, it's how well do you respond to it? How open are you to receiving that training? If you're not open to it, it doesn't matter what level of training you're going to have, you're never going to conduct yourself in a manner that's consistent with that training. And that's what I call, and I talk about the police culture, how the police culture will trump policy and training. The culture has to align itself with the policies, procedures, and the training practices of the organization and make sure they're all aligned with the specific values and expectations of the organization, the society in which you serve.
Jeff, can you tell us a bit about your book, The Thin Ice? We'd like to learn more about what is it? What's the book?
My book is called On Thin Ice, and it's coming out this spring. Essentially what it is, I share my personal background, my professional experiences, and my practical insights in regards to what I believe are the actionable solutions moving forward for law enforcement to be successful in the 21st century. And it's really the only book of its kind. It's an honest assessment of where law enforcement has been, where it is now, and what needs to be done for it to be successful moving forward.
Good to know. Thanks for sharing that with my audience. Do you like to share your social media handles and your website, if any? And perhaps you have another project or exciting news or information you think is going to be beneficial to the audience. You can go ahead and share that if there is any.
Well, sure. In regards to my book, On Thin Ice, you can go to jeffwennigner.com and that will take you to a landing page for the book where you can put in your name and your email, and you'll be put on a mailing list. In regards to my company, I'm the founder and CEO of Law Enforcement Consultants, and it's a consulting company where we consult law enforcement agencies to minimize their liability and hopefully close the gap between the expectations of law enforcement and their communities they serve. You can also find me as Jeff Wennigner on LinkedIn, as well as Jeff Wennigner on Facebook.
Right, good to know. Thank you, Jeff Wennigner. You're a nationally recognized expert in law enforcement. As a retired lieutenant with over 33 years of experience, primarily with the LAPD, that's a Los Angeles Police Department. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on today's topic, especially the law enforcement in the US. What has changed and which way can we improve upon it? Thanks for sharing your expertise and your experience in this regard to the audience of the Backstory with Omobola Stephen. Sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, on behalf of the audience, we wish you best of luck in this book projects and in all the projects that you embark upon, Jeff.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. If you'd like to catch up with any missed episodes of the show, you can do so on any cross-promotion platforms or any podcast distribution platforms you bump into. Just search for The Backstory with Omobola Stephen, and do have a great time as you listen to expert and professionals that share profound insight, disruptive yet constructive mindship conversations on government and politics topics, with other subtopics like the society and culture, science and technology, the economy, and also the fun line. So I would like you to always stay safe. I talk to you soon. Thank you once again, Jeff. That was a great show.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you subscribe and leave us a review.